All right, welcome back to this New Year's edition of Tragedy and Hope Live. I'll probably be reading this book for the rest of the year. All right, so before we get into the book, we're gonna check out the ball drop in New York, not the actual ball drop. I watched the ball drop. It's like LED lights now or something. Pretty interesting. So apparently the first ball drop was in 1907, going into 1908. It's been updated 7 times. The original ball was 5 feet in diameter, constructed from wood and iron, and had 100 light bulbs. Now it has 32,000 LEDs, and the new one looked like it was like straight up just like a flat screen TV or something. Looked pretty fancy. And it says, since 1999, 2000, I was there that year. The Y2K, we thought everything was going to blow up, so we just went there. The ball featured an outer surface consisting of crystal panels manufactured by Waterford Crystal, which contain inscriptions and designs representing a yearly theme. I guess the ball stays up on top of the building all the time. Pretty interesting. I guess it's a New York thing, though. Everybody else just does like fireworks. All right. Okay, so we're still on the policy of appeasement 1931 to 1936 on page 586. The Spanish tragedy 1931 to 1939. From the summer of 1936 to the spring of 1939, Spain was the scene of a bitter conflict of arms, ideologies, and interests. This conflict was both a civil war and an international struggle. It was a controversial problem at the time and has remained a controversial problem since. For 20 or more years, the bitter feelings raised by the struggle remained so intense that it was difficult to determine the facts of the dispute, and anyone who tried to make an objective study of the facts was subjected to abuse from both sides. The historical past of Spain has been so different from that of the rest of Western civilization that it sometimes seems doubtful if it should be regarded as part of Western civilization. This difference is increased by the fact that, since the late 15th century, Spain has refused to share in the experiences of Western civilization and, if many powerful groups could have their wish, would have remained in its 15th or 16th century condition. From the invasion of the Arabs in 711 to their final ejection in 1492, Spanish life was dominated by the struggle against this foreign intruder. From 1525 to 1648, Spain was in a struggle with the new religious movement aroused by Luther. Since 1648, it has been, except for brief intervals and for exceptional personalities, at war with modern rationalism and modern science, with the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and Napoleon, with modern democracy, modern secularism, modern liberalism, modern constitutionalism, and the bourgeois conception of modern society as a whole. As a result of more than 1,000 years of such struggles, almost all elements of Spanish society, even those which were not, in theory, opposed to the new movements in Western culture, have developed a fanatical intolerance, an uncompromising individualism, and a fatal belief that physical force is the solution to all problems, however spiritual. The impact of the bourgeois, liberal, scientific, and industrialized West of the 19th century upon Spain was similar to its impact on other backwards political units such as Japan, China, Turkey, or Russia. In each case, some elements of these societies wished to resist the political expansion of the West by adopting its industry, science, military organization, and constitutional structures. Other elements wished to resist all westernization by passive opposition, if nothing more effective could be found, to the death if necessary, and to keep secreted in their hearts and minds the older native attitudes, even if their bodies were compelled to yield to alien Western patterns of action. In Spain, Russia, and China, this attitude of resistance was sufficiently successful to delay the process of westernization to a date when Western civilization was beginning to lose its own tradition, or at least its faith in it, and to shift its allegiances, or at least its behavior, to patterns of thought and action which were quite foreign to the main line of Western tradition. This shift, to which we have referred in the first section of this present chapter, was marked by a loss of the basic element of modernization to be found in the real tradition of the West. As ideological intolerance or totalitarian authoritarianism, for example, grew in the West, this was bound to have an adverse effect upon efforts to carry Western democracy, liberalism, or parliamentary constitutionalism to areas like Japan, China, Russia, or, the case in point, Spain. During the 19th century, the elements willing at least to compromise with the Western way of life were not completely unsuccessful in Spain, probably because they received a certain amount of support from the army, which realized its inability to fight effectively without a largely westernized society to support it. This, however, was destroyed by the efforts of the Restoration Monarchy of 1875 to 1931 to find support among the opponents of modernization and by the Spanish defeat at the hands of the United States in 1898. Alfonso XII, 1874 to 1885, came to the throne as a military reaction after a long period of revolutionary confusion. The defeat by the United States, like the Chinese defeat by Japan in 1894 or the Turkish defeat by Russia in 1877, widened the gap between the progressive and reactionary groups in Spain, if we may use these terms to indicate a willingness or a refusal to westernize. Moreover, the War of 1898, by depriving Spain of much of its empire, left its oversized army with little to do and with a reduced area on which to batten. Like a vampire octopus, the Spanish army settled down to drain the lifeblood of Spain and, above all, Morocco. This brought the army, meaning the officers, into alignment with the other conservative forces in Spain against the scanty forces of bourgeois liberalism and the rapidly growing forces of proletarian discontent. These conservative forces consisted of the church, meaning the upper clergy, the landlords, and the monarchists. The forces of proletarian discontent consisted of the urban workers and the much larger mass of exploited peasants. These latter groups, which had no real acquaintance with the Western liberal tradition and found it of little hope when they did, were fertile soil for the agitators of proletarian revolution who were already challenging the bourgeois liberalism of the West. To be sure, Spanish individualism, provincialism, and suspicion of the state as an instrument of possessing classes made any appeal to totalitarian authoritarianism of communism relatively weak in Spain. On the other hand, the appeal of anarchism, which was both individualist and anti-state, was stronger in Spain than anywhere else on earth. Stronger even than in Russia, where anarchism received its most complete verbal formulations at the hands of men like Bakunin. Finally, the appeal of socialism was almost as strong as anarchism and much more effectively organized. Socialism to many discontented Spaniards, including many bourgeois intellectuals and professional men, seemed to offer a combination of social reform, economic progress, and a democratic secular state which was better fitted to Spanish needs than anarchism, Bolshevism, or laissez-faire constitutionalism. The weak link in this socialist program was that the democratic, non-totalitarian state envisioned by the socialist intellectuals in Spain was quite compatible with Spanish individualism and basic democracy, but quite at variance with Spanish intolerance. There was a legitimate ground for doubt that any such socialist state, if it came to power in Spain, would be tolerant enough to permit that intellectual disagreement which is so necessary for a democratic society, even one directing a socialist economic system. The bourgeois of Spain, relatively few in number, because of Spain's economic backwardness, were in a difficult position. While the bourgeois of England and France had attacked the forces of feudalism, bureaucratic monarchy, militarism, and clericalism, and had created a liberal secular state and a bourgeois society before they were themselves attacked by the rising forces of proletarian discontent on their left, the bourgeois of Spain could see the proletarian threat from the left before they were able to overcome the vested interest of the right. As a result of this, the bourgeois tended to split into two parts. On the one hand were industrial and commercial bourgeoisie, who supported the liberal ideas of laissez-faire, constitutional parliamentarism, private property, anti-militarism, anti-bureaucratic freedom, anti-clericalism, and a limited state authority. On the other hand were the intellectual and professional bourgeois, who would have added to this program a sufficient degree of social reform, democracy, economic interventionism, and nationalization of property to put them into the socialist camp. Both these divisions of the bourgeois group tended to move further to the right after 1931, as the growing pressure of proletarian revolution threatened both private property and liberal democracy. The bourgeois liberals feared the loss of private property, and, to save it, hastily abandoned their earlier anti-militarism, anti-clericalism, and such. The bourgeois socialists feared the loss of liberal democracy, but they found nowhere to go because liberal democracy could find no real basis in the fanatical intolerance of Spain, a feature as prevalent on the right as on the left. In truth, both bourgeois groups were largely crushed out and their members practically exterminated by the right because of their earlier allegiance to anti-militarism, anti-clericalism, and anti-monarchism, and by the left because of their continued allegiance to private property. Strangely enough, the only defenders these bourgeois found outside their own group was in a small but well-organized body of Stalinist communists whose ideological preconceptions of the nature of the natural course of social development were so strong that they insisted that Spain must pass through a period of bourgeois liberal capitalism and industrialization before it would be ripe for the later stages of totalitarian communism. This point of view, explicitly stated in Stalin's letter to the Spanish left-wing socialist leader Largo Calavera on September 21st, 1936, warned against premature efforts toward social and economic reforms for which Spain's degree of industrial development made it quite unready, and called for general anti-fascist support for a liberal state against the reactionaries on the right. In consequence of this point of view, the communists in Spain were almost as willing to exterminate the revolutionaries on the left, especially the anarchist, Trotskyist, communist, and left wing socialist, as they were to eliminate the reactionaries of the right. This complex and confused situation in Spain was made even more involved by the struggle between Castilian centralization, which was frequently unenlightened and reactionary, and the supporters of local autonomy and separatism, which were frequently progressive or even revolutionary in Catalonia, the Basque Country, Galicia, and elsewhere. This struggle was intensified by the fact that industrialism had grown up only in Catalonia and the Basque provinces, and accordingly the strength of the revolutionary proletariat was strongest in these areas, where separatism was strongest. Opposed to all these forces was that alignment of officers, upper clergy, landlords, and monarchists which came into existence after 1898, and especially after 1918. The army was the poorest in Europe and relatively the most expensive. There was a commissioned officer for every 6 men and a general for every 250 men. The men were miserably underpaid and mistreated, while the officers squandered fortunes. The Ministry of War took about a third of the national budget, and most of that went to the officers. Money was wasted or stolen, especially in Morocco, in lumps of millions at a time for the benefit of officers and monarchist politicians. Everything was done on a lavish scale. For example, there were no less than 5 military academies, but the army remained so inefficient that it lost 13,000 men a year for 10 years fighting the rifts in Morocco, and in July 1921 lost 12,000 killed out of 20,000 engaged in one battle. Damn. The army had the right, incredible as it may seem, to court-martial civilians, and did not hesitate to use this power to prevent criticism of its depredations. Nevertheless, the outcry against corruption and defeats in Morocco resulted in a parliamentary investigation. To prevent this, a military coup under General Primo de Rivera, with the acquiescence of King Alfonso XIII, took over the government, dissolved the courts, and ended civil liberties with martial law and a strict censorship throughout Spain in 1923. The landlords not only monopolized the land, but, more important than that, squandered their incomes with little effort to increase the productivity of their estates or to reduce the violent discontent of their peasant tenants and agricultural workers. Of the 125 million acres of arable land in Spain, about 60% was not cultivated, while another 10% was left fallow. The need for irrigation, fertilizers, and new methods was acute, but very little was done to achieve them. On the contrary, the Spanish grandees wasted millions of pestes in the gambling casinos of the French Riviera. The technical equipment of their estates steadily deteriorated. Making use of surplus agricultural population, they sought to increase rents and to decrease agricultural wages. To permit this, they made every effort to make leases shorter in duration, not over a year, and revocable at the landlord's will, and to break up every effort of agricultural workers to seek government or unionized action to raise wages, reduce hours, or improve working conditions. While all this was going on, and while most of Spain was suffering from malnutrition, most of the land was still untilled. The owners refused to use irrigation facilities which had been built by the government. As a result, agricultural yields were the poorest in Western Europe, while 15 men owned about 1 million acres and 15,000 men owned about a half of all taxed land. Almost 2 million owned the other half, frequently in plots too small for subsistence. About 2 million more, who were completely landless, worked 10 to 14 hours a day for about 2.5 pastas, 35 cents a day for only 6 months in a year, or paid exorbitant rents without any security of tenure. In the church, while the ordinary priest, especially in the villages, shared the poverty and tribulations of the people, and did so with pious devotion, the upper clergy were so closely allied with the government and the forces of reaction. The bishops and archbishops were named by the monarchy and were partly supported by an annual grant from the government as a result of the Concordat of 1851. Moreover, the clergy and the government were inextricably intertwined, the upper clergy having seats in the upper chamber, control of education, censorship, marriage, and the willing ear of the king. In consequence of this alliance of the upper clergy with the government and the forces of reaction, all the animosities built up against the latter came to be directed against the former also. Although the Spanish people remained universally and profoundly Catholic, and found no attraction whatsoever in Protestantism and very little attraction in rational skepticism of the French sort, they also became indelibly anti-clerical. This attitude was reflected in the notable reluctance of Spanish men to go to church or receive the sacraments during the interval between confirmation at the age of 13 and extreme unction on their deathbeds. It was also reflected in the proclivity of the Spanish people for burning churches. While other peoples expressed turbulent outbursts of anti-governmental feelings and attacks on prisons, post offices, banks, or radio stations, the Spaniards invariably burned churches, and have done so for at least a century. There were great outbursts of this strange custom in 1808, 1835, 1874, 1909, 1931, and 1936, and it was indulged in by the right as well as by the left. The monarchists were divided into at least two groups. One of these, the Revocación Española, supported the dynasty of Isabella II, 1833 to 1868, while the other, Comunión Tradicionalistas, supported the claims of Isabella's uncle Don Carlos. The Renovation Group was a clique of wealthy landowners who used their contacts with the government to evade taxes and to obtain concessions and censures for themselves and their friends. The Carlists were a fanatical, intolerant, and murderous group from remote rural regions of Spain and were almost entirely clerical and reactionary in their aims. All of these groups, the landlords, officers, higher clergy, and monarchists, except the Carlists, were interest groups seeking to utilize Spain for their own power and profit. The threat to their positions following the First World War and the defeats in Morocco led them to support Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. However, the general's personal instability and his efforts to appease the industrialists of Catalonia, as well as his unbalanced budgets and his effort to build up a popular following by cooperating with labor groups, led to a shift of support, and he was forced to resign in 1930. following an unsuccessful officers' revolt in 1929. Realizing the danger to his dynasty from his association with an unpopular dictatorship, Alfonso XIII tried to restore the constitutional government. As a first step, he ordered municipal elections for April 12, 1931. Such elections had been managed successfully by wholesale electoral corruption before 1923, and it was believed that this control could be maintained. It was maintained in the rural areas, but in 46 out of 50 provincial capitals, the anti-monarchical forces were victorious. When these forces demanded Alfonso's abdication, he called upon General Sanjurjo, commander of the Civil Guard, for support. It was refused, and Alfonso fled to France April 14, 1931. The Republicans at once began to organize their victory, electing a constituent assembly in June 1931 and establishing an ultra-modern unicameral parliamentary government with universal suffrage, separation of church and state, secularization of education, local autonomy for separatist areas, and power to socialize the great estates or public utilities. Such a government, especially the provisions for a parliamentary regime with universal suffrage, was quite unfitted for Spain with its high illiteracy, its weak middle class, and its great inequities in economic power. The Republic lasted only 5 years before the Civil War began on July 18, 1936. During that period, it was challenged constantly from the right and from the extreme left, the former offering the greatest test because it commanded economic, military, and ideological power through the landlords, the army, and the church. During this time, the nation was ruled by a coalition government. First, by a coalition of the left from December 1931 to September 1933, then by the center from September 1933 to October 1934, third by a coalition of the right from October 1934 to the Popular Front election of February 1936, and last by the left after February 1936. These shifts of government resulted from changes in alignment of attitudes. These shifts of government resulted from changes in alignments of the multitude of political parties. The right formed a coalition under Jose Maria Gil Robles in February 1933, while the left formed a coalition under Manuel Azaña in February 1936. As a result, the right coalition won the second parliamentary election in November 1933, while the left won the third, or Popular Front, election of February 1936. Because of this shifting of governments, the liberal program, which was enacted into law in 1931 to 1933, was annulled or unenforced in 1933 to 1936. This program included educational reform, army reform, separation of church and state, agrarian reform, and social assistance for peasants and workers. In an effort to reduce illiteracy, which was over 45% in 1930, the Republic created thousands of new schools and new teachers, raised teachers' salaries to a minimum of about $450 per year. This affected 21,000 out of 37,000 teachers, founded over 1,000 new libraries, and encouraged adult education. Efforts were made to obtain a smaller, better paid, more efficient army. The 23,000 officers, including 258 generals, were reduced to 9,500 officers, including 86 generals. the surplus being retired on full pay. The number of enlisted men was reduced to about 100,000 with higher pay. Organization was completely reformed. As a result, over 14 million was saved on the cost of the army in the first year, 1931 to 1932. Unfortunately, nothing was done to make the army loyal to the new regime. Since the choice to retire or stay on active duty was purely voluntary, the Republican officers tended to retire, the monarchists to stay on, with the result that the army of the Republic was more monarchist in its sympathies than the army had been before 1931. Although officers, disgruntled at their narrowing opportunities for enriching themselves, were openly disrespectful and insubordinate towards the Republic, almost nothing was done to remedy this. The church was subjected to laws establishing complete separation of church and state. The government gave up its right to nominate the upper clergy, ended the annual grant to the church, took ownership but not possession of church property, forbade teaching in public schools by the clergy, established religious toleration and civil divorce, and required that all corporations, including religious orders and trade unions, must register with the government and publish financial accounts. To assist the peasants and workers, mixed juries were established to hear rural rent disputes, importation of labor from one district to another for wage-breaking purposes was forbidden, and credit was provided for peasants to obtain land, seeds, or fertilizers on favorable terms. Wow, remember when the left actually didn't want immigration because it was bad for workers? Manorial lands, those of monarchists who had fled with Alfonso, and customarily uncultivated lands were expropriated with compensation to provide farms for a new class of peasant proprietors. Most of these reforms went into effect only partially or not at all. The annual contribution to the church could not be ended because the Spanish people refused to contribute voluntarily to the church, and an alternative system of ecclesiastical taxation enforced by the state had to be set up. Few of the abandoned or poorly cultivated estates could be expropriated because of lack of money for compensation. The clergy could not be excluded from teaching because of the lack of trained teachers. Most expropriated ecclesiastical property was left in the control of the church, either because it was necessary for religious and social services or because it could not be tracked down. The conservative groups reacted violently against the Republic almost as soon as it began. In fact, the monarchists criticized Alfonso for leaving without a struggle, while the upper clergy and landlords ostracized the papal legate for his efforts to make the former adopt a neutral attitude towards the new regime. As a result, three plots began to be formed against the Republic. The one monarchist led by Calvo Setolo in Parliament and by Antonio Giacosia behind the scenes. The second, a parliamentary alliance of landlords and clericals under Jose Maria Gil Robles, and the last, a conspiracy of officers under Generals Emilio Barrera and Jose Sanjurjo. Sanjurjo led an unsuccessful rebellion at Seville in August 1932. When it collapsed from lack of public support, he was arrested, condemned to death, reprieved, and finally released with all his back pay in 1934. Barrera was arrested but released by the courts. Both generals began to prepare for the rebellion of 1936. In the meantime, the monarchist conspiracy was organized by former King Alfonso from abroad as early as 1931. As part of his movement, a new political party was founded under Soleto. A research organization known as Spanish Action was set up to publish texts from great thinkers on the legality of revolution. A war chest of 1.5 million pestas was created, and an underground conspiracy was drawn up under the leadership of Antonio Giacochea. This last action was taken at a meeting in Paris presided over by Alfonso himself, September 29, 1932. Giacochea performed his task with great skill, under the eyes of a government which refused to take preventative action because of its own liberal and legalistic scruples. He organized an alliance of the officers, the Carlist, and his own Alphonsist party. 4 men from these 3 groups then signed an agreement with Mussolini on March 31, 1934. By this agreement, the Duce of Fascism promised arms, money, and diplomatic support to the revolutionary movement and gave the conspirators a first installment payment of 1,500,000 pesetas, 10,000 rifles, 10,000 grenades, and 200 machine guns. In return, the signers, Lieutenant General Emilio Barrera, Antonio Lizarza, Rafael de Olazabal, and Antonio Giacochea promised when they came to power to denounce the existing French-Spanish secret treaty and to sign with Mussolini an agreement establishing a joint export policy between Spain and Italy, as well as an agreement to maintain the status quo in the Western Mediterranean. In the meantime, Gil Robles' coalition, known as CEDA, C-E-D-A, Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rights Parties, along with his own clerical party, Popular Action, and the Agrarian Party of Big Landlords, was able to replace the left Republican Manuel Azaña by the right Republican Alejandro Lerroux as Prime Minister, September 1933. Then it called new elections in November 1934 and won a victory with 213 seats for the right, 130 for the center, and 121 for the left. The center cabinet continued in office, supported by the votes of the right. It revoked many of the reforms of 1931 to 1933, allowed most of the rest to go unenforced, released all the rightist conspirators from prison, including Sanjurjo, gave an amnesty to thousands of monarchist plotters and exiles, and restored their expropriated estates. By a process of consolidating portfolios and abolishing cabinet seats, Gil Robles slowly reduced the cabinet from 13 ministers at the end of 1933 to 9 2 years later. Of these, CEDA took over 3 in October 1934 and 5 in March 1935. The advent to office of CEDA in October 1934 led to a violent agitation which burst into open revolt in the 2 separate centers of the Basque Country and Catalonia. The latter, led by the bourgeois left, received little support from the workers and collapsed at once. The uprising in Asturias, however, spearheaded by anarchist miners hurling dynamite from slings, lasted for 9 days. The government used the Foreign Legion and Moors, brought from Morocco by sea, and crushed the rebels without mercy. The latter suffered at least 5,000 casualties, of which a third were dead. After the uprising was quelled, all the socialist press was silenced. all the socialist press was silenced, and 25,000 suspects were thrown into prison. This uprising of October 1934, although crushed, served to split the oligarchy. The fact that the government had sent Moors to the most Catholic part of Spain, where they had never penetrated during the Saracen invasion, and the demands of the army, monarchists, and the biggest landlords for a ruthless dictatorship alarmed the leaders of the church and the president of the republic, Alcala Zamora. This ultimately blocked Gil Roble's road to power by parliamentary methods. After March 1935, he controlled the portfolios of justice, industry and commerce, labor, and communications, but could not get the interior, which controlled the police. This was held by Portela Valladares, a moderate close to Zamora. Gil Robles, as Minister of War, encouraged reactionary control of the army and even put General Franco in as his Undersecretary for War, but he cannot get rid of Portela Valladares. Finally, he demanded that the police be transferred from the Ministry of Interior to his own Ministry of War. When this was refused, he upset the cabinet, but instead of getting more from this action, he got less, for Alcala Zamora handed the premier's seat over to moderates Joaquin Chapa Prieta, a businessman, followed by Portela Valladares, and ordered new elections. For these elections of February 1936, the parties of the left formed a coalition, the Popular Front, with a published program and plan of action. The program was of a moderate left character, promising a full restoration of the Constitution, amnesty for political crimes committed after November 1933, civil liberties, an independent judiciary, minimum wages, protection for tenants, reform of taxation, credit, banking, and the police and public works. It repudiated the socialist program for nationalization of the land, banks, and industry. The plan of action provided that while all Popular Front parties would support the government by their votes in the courts, only the bourgeois parties would hold seats in the cabinet, while the workers' parties, such as the Socialists, would remain outside. The election of February 16, 1936, followed a campaign of violence and terrorism in which the worst offenders were the members of a microscopic new party calling itself the Phalange, openly fascist on the Italian model and consisting largely of a small number of rich and irresponsible youths. This group was led by Primo de Rivera the Younger. In the election, the Popular Front captured 266 out of 473 seats, while the right had 153 and the center only 54. CETA had 96, the Socialist 87, Azania's Republican left 81, the Communist 14. The defeated forces of the right refused to accept the results of this election. As soon as the results were known, Sotelo tried to persuade Portela Valladares to hand over the government to General Franco. That was rebuffed. The same day, the Phalange attacked workers who were celebrating. On February 20th, the conspirators met and decided their plans were not yet ripe. The new government heard of this meeting and at once transferred General Franco to the Canary Islands, General Manuel Goded to the Balearics, and General Emilio Mola from his command in Morocco to be Governor General of Navarre, a Carlist stronghold. The day before Franco left Madrid, he met the chief conspirators at the home of the monarchist deputy Serrano Delgado. They completed their plans for a military revolt but fixed no date. In the meantime, provocation, assassination, and retaliation grew steadily with the verbal encouragement of the right. Property was seized or destroyed, and churches were burned on all sides. On March 12th, the socialist lawyer who had drafted the Constitution of 1931 was fired at from an automobile, and his companion was killed. 5 men were brought to trial. The judge was assassinated April 13th. The next day, a bomb exploded beneath a platform from which the new cabinet was reviewing the troops, and a police lieutenant was killed April 14th. The mob retaliated by assaults on monarchists and by burning churches. On March 15th, there was an attempt to assassinate Largo Cabrillo. By May, the monarchist assassins were beginning to concentrate on the officers of the assault guards, the only branch of the police which was completely loyal to the Republic. In May, the captain of this force, Farayudo, was killed by shots from a speeding automobile. On July 12th, Lieutenant Castillo of the same force was killed in the same way. That night, a group of men in uniform of the assault guards took Sotelo from his bed and shot him. The uprising, however, was already beginning in England and Italy and broke out in Morocco on July 18th. One of the chief figures in the conspiracy in England was Douglas Jerrold, a well-known editor, who has revealed some details in his autobiography. At the end of May 1936, he obtained 50 machine guns and 500,000 rounds of SA ammunition for the cause. In June, he persuaded Major Hugh Pollard to fly to the Canary Islands in order to transport General Franco by plane to Morocco. Pollard took off on July 11th with his 19-year-old daughter Diana and her friend Dorothy Watson. Louis Bolin, who was Gerald's chief contact with the conspirators, went at once to Rome. On July 15th, orders were issued by the Italian Air Force to certain units to prepare to fly to Spanish Morocco. The Italian insignia on these planes were roughly painted over on July 20th and thereafter, but otherwise they were fully equipped. These planes went into action in support of the revolt as early as July 27th. On July 30th, 4 such planes, still carrying their orders of July 15th, landed in French Algeria and were interned. German intervention was less carefully planned. It would appear that San Hirojo went to Berlin on February 4th, 1936, but could get no commitment beyond a promise to provide the necessary transport planes to move the Moroccan forces to Spain if the Spanish fleet made transport by sea dangerous by remaining loyal to the government. As soon as Franco reached Morocco from the Canaries on July 18th, he appealed for these planes through a personal emissary to Hitler and through the German consul at Tutan. The former met Hitler on July 24th and was promised assistance. The plans to intervene were drawn up the same night by Hitler, Goering, and General Werner von Blumberg. 30 planes with German crews were sent to Spain by August 8th, and the first one was captured by the Loyalist government the next day. In the meantime, the revolt was a failure. The Navy remained loyal because the crews overthrew their officers. The Air Force generally remained loyal. The Army revolted, along with much of the police. But except in isolated areas, these rebellious units were overcome. At the first news of the revolt, the people, led by the labor unions and the militia of the workers' political parties, demanded arms. The government was reluctant because of fear of revolution from the left as well as the right, and delayed for several days. Two cabinets resigned on July 18th and July 19th rather than arm the left, but a new cabinet under Jose Guerrero was willing to do so. Because arms were lacking, orders were sent at once to France. The recognized government in Madrid had the right to buy arms abroad and was even bound to do so to some degree by the existing commercial treaty with France. As a result of the failure of the revolt, the generals found themselves isolated in several different parts of Spain with no mass popular support, and with control of none of the three chief industrial areas. The rebels held the extreme northwest, Galicia and Leon, the north Navarre, and the south western Andalusia, as well as Morocco and the islands. They had the unlimited support of Italy and Portugal, as well as unlimited sympathy and tentative support from Germany. But the rebel position was desperate by the end of July. On July 25th, the German ambassador informed his government that the revolt could not succeed unless something unforeseen happens. By August 25th, the acting State Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Germany, Hans Dietkhoff, wrote, "It is not expected to be that Franco government can hold out for long, even after outward successes, without large-scale support from outside." Alright, I'm just going to stop reading that, because there's just like tons more pages. And it's just a bunch of run-on sentences. I mean, there's not really much to say about this, just that you can see how the government works. The government does whatever it wants, and then it kind of like worries about what people are going to think afterwards. Or it tries to run PR to try to make them think something else. But that's like really detailed history stuff where it's like, who actually cares? Like what people were doing on Tuesday. Like some of the stuff, I mean, it's good to know history in chronological order, but I mean, to know every single person's name and every single date of everything that happened, like, it's not like a realistic way to look at history. So, yeah. That's pretty much it for this episode. I think I might do a separate video or something talking about capitalism and stuff, because obviously libertarians get mad whenever you criticize capitalism. But I mean, I'm not saying I'm a capitalist, but I mean, obviously I'm an American and we all practice capitalism. I'm not like against capitalism. But I mean, I guess a good way you can look at capitalism is that it's kind of like, it's like America's greatest strength, but it's also its greatest weakness, right? Because it's like, yeah, okay, capitalism works distributing resources. It's like the best way to distribute resources. It's not really the best way, but it's a fair way, kind of. If it worked in theory, where there was like a meritocracy, then it would be the best way to distribute resources. But it's also like the biggest weakness, because then it's like, for instance, Chinese nationals can come over here and buy our government. They can buy huge tracts of farmland and buy like industrial parks and raise the price of living for everyone that's an American citizen, right? So it's like, it's a double-edged sword, whatever you want to call it. Double-edged sword. It's like our biggest strength, our biggest weakness. So it's something that you have to pay attention to. You can't just be like a capitalist realist and just be like, oh, capitalism, it always works in every situation. We got to always apply capitalism. Sometimes you need like ethics or other systems, like sometimes you do need a little utilitarianism, like scientific analysis, logical analysis, different, different things for different situations. Like capitalism just is not going to fix the quote unquote spiritual problems, if whether you're religious or not religious. You want to say like the negative effects of modernization. Capitalism is the cause of modernization, so it's not going to fix the problems of modernization, right? So there has to be some other approach or other way to look at society, whether it's from a religious viewpoint or a philosophical viewpoint or some type of other viewpoint other than just looking at it from a capitalist viewpoint, right? Because that's part of the problem, right? It's part of the problem that, our politicians, even though they're supposed to be getting paid, seem so desperate for money that people can literally bribe them and blackmail them, all the Jeffrey Epstein stuff and just the most bog standard like lobbying and stuff like that. Like why is that even a thing? Like why is, like, realistically, like it doesn't make sense, because it's obvious that if you're only going to base your politics on money, then the rich people are just going to make laws to make it so that they stay rich. It's like the whole maintaining the status quo thing, right? And like I said, if it's like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, or like a while ago, where it's like it seems like capitalism is the only, like, it's not really a philosophical system, but it's the only like human worldview where if somebody said, hey, you could make a huge profit if you could build a bomb that would actually destroy the entire planet. And capitalism is like the only like human worldview that someone would actually even contemplate. Well, how much money would I make if I built a bomb that blew up the entire planet? Right? Like every other worldview is like, no, you just don't build a bomb unless like Satanism or something like that. Every other worldview is just like, no, you just don't build a bomb. Like there is no profit. Like profit doesn't exist once you blow up the planet. But a capitalist, like, well, wait a minute. How much am I going to profit? Right? So it's like I'm saying, it's our biggest strength and our biggest weakness as well. So with that, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks for watching the video. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this. Everybody have a happy new year and peace.